Men in Black on the scene within hours. Files vanished overnight. Officers resigned in terror, all to cover up one impossible truth. I'm Carol Ann. Welcome to The In-Between. The following story is a deathbed account from someone who needed the world to know the truth. It's been shared to us here at The In-Between by his friend, a regular viewer who wishes to remain anonymous. And after you hear this story, you'll know why. For the sake of this story, we're going to call our in-betweener Ted. But the story isn't about Ted. He's just the brave messenger. The story is what was written in a letter to Ted from his longtime friend, whom we are going to call Dan. Ted and Dan served in the Army together. And there's something about those bonds that never break. Maybe that's why Dan chose Ted as the most trustworthy person with whom he could think of to share his experience, having faith that Ted would know what to do with it. So from Dan to Ted to the in-between to you, here is Dan's story. Dan served over 20 years in the Army as a correctional specialist and retired with an honorable discharge and a pension. But life isn't over yet, so Dan moves to Alaska and gets a job in the sheriff's department in a city somewhere on the banks of the Yukon River, where he eventually becomes the night shift sergeant at the county jail. He loves that job. But roll on another 20 years into the 1990s, Dan's had enough. He's worked hard for a long time, and it's time to enjoy the rewards. Puts in his retirement notice to be effective in a few weeks and starts planning a move to a warmer climate. On this particular night, Dan feels good as he rocks on up to the station. His plans are going well, and it's sub-zero temperatures tonight. Not that he likes the cold, but that generally means a slow night at the county jail. Less people outside, less people in trouble. Not that he really worried about it. Between the Army and the sheriff's department, Dan has dealt with every kind of lowlife and weirdo imaginable. But tonight, it's going to be different. He just doesn't know it yet. The quiet that Dan had been hoping for doesn't last long. The hospital psych ward calls to let them know that they are bringing one of their patients over. This guy's totally out of control and attacked both medical staff and hospital security guards. They are at their wits' end with this guy and are sending him over to hopefully cool off for a while in jail. As Dan and the others meet the car coming into the county jail's intake garage, they watch as a pudgy, balding, 5'5", 50-year-old man with bulging eyes that never stop moving in an attempt to either alleviate or confirm his paranoia steps out of the car. The little hair he has left is sticking out everywhere, and he ceaselessly mumbles on about nothing anyone can understand. Just as they're about to take custody, it hits them like a ton of bricks. The smell! The man had been at the hospital for quite a while, and unbeknownst to any of the deputies, had refused to shower the entire time. But overall, he seems pretty calm, so they bring him inside to the booking area. Between information from the hospital and from prior arrests, they have pretty much all of the information that they needed, so actually getting him processed into the jail goes pretty quickly. But they do have some questions for him. The whole time Dan is trying to get answers, the guy standing there, rocking back and forth and continuing the constant mumbling. The only things Dan can understand are a few snippets about how they were coming and that nothing can stop them. So, this not being Dan's first rodeo, he starts asking the man questions about the things he can actually understand, showing the man that he's actually interested in what's going on with him and letting the man know that he's here to help him. And sometimes it just takes that little bit of concern to change someone's world. The man starts opening up to Dan. "You're the police, and I'll be protected as long as I'm with you guys, right?" "Protect you from what?" The man points his index finger straight up. At this moment, Dan is grateful for the 40 years of training in a serious business that gave him an iron poker face, even though he's grinning on the inside. You mean protect you from something from outer space? The man quietly and carefully answers, E.T. Now, this is certainly not the first person Dan has ever met who believed that extraterrestrials are visiting this planet. And while I'm sure there are some people out there who would beg to differ, most rational people agree that someone believing in life from another planet visiting this one does not make you a crazy person. The man was not in the hospital for believing in ETs. He was in the hospital because of his sometimes violent behavior that posed a risk to himself or others. And Dan knows that if he does his best to treat this man gently and calmly and let the man know that he's actually listening to him, the man might just calm down and let Dan help him. Dan doesn't actually have to believe him, but a lot of times people in the same situation this man is in just want to know that someone is listening. And it works. Takes a bit of doing, but Dan finally convinces the man that he will feel so much better about everything if he takes a nice hot shower and puts on some clean clothes. As it turns out, the reason the man had stopped taking showers at the hospital is that he was afraid that the aliens would be able to telepathically take over the staff, who could then attack him while he's vulnerable. I mean, naked in the shower is about as vulnerable as it gets. But Dan just gently lets him know that the facility is designed to shield anyone inside from any kind of outside alien mind control. Amazingly enough, that works too. And the man starts undressing to get ready for the shower. Much to Dan's surprise and, dare I say, probably confusion, he sees that the man's whole body is covered in some kind of lotion or something that looks more like pancake batter. Seeing the perplexed look on Dan's face, the man informs Dan that it's for protection against being tracked by the aliens. The man showers, and when he's done, Dan notices the man's left bicep is wrapped in copper tape, and the tape looks like it's been there a long time. Dan asks him if the tape is for some kind of injury. If so, just let him know and they can note it in his intake report. No, it's not an injury. The aliens put an implant in my arm a long time ago so they could track me. The tape is there to block the signal. Does it help? Not really. They still manage to find me no matter what I do. Okay, well, since we're in a signal-shielded building here, I think it's safe for you to take that off. The man looks at Dan nervously, but trusting that Dan really has his best interest at heart and wouldn't lie to him about the building's shielded design, he finally takes Dan's advice and takes off the copper tape. All right, there we go. All showered and clean and smelling pretty again. The man changes into his provided jail jumpsuit and rubber slippers. And Dan is mentally crossing his fingers that all of this will help the man relax and sleep through the night. The two men walk down the hall to a single holding cell in the processing area. The man actually seems to relax a little when he sees the cell. It's like his own little safe space where he can hide and not have to worry about anything happening. So, in he goes. Dan closes the door, and peace reigns throughout the entire county jail. For about a hot minute, the man is not in his cell more than 15 minutes before he starts screaming for help. Dan runs over to the door and looks in through the peephole. The man is in the same agitated state he was in when he first got there, swaying side to side and mumbling to himself between cries for help. He's wrapped his blanket around himself like a toga and is using the Gideon's Bible provided in every cell as a shield around his arm where the copper tape used to be. Dan tries to talk to him in soothing tones. Hey, man, what's the problem? Just talk to me, okay? What's going on? They know I'm here. They know I'm here, and I'm not safe. I hear them signaling one another, and they're coming to get me. Dan does his best to try to talk the guy back down, telling him that no one is coming to get him. There's no way anyone can get to him. If they try, they'll have to go through Dan first and he won't let that happen. But Dan's reassurances are not working this time. The man keeps yelling at the top of his lungs, pounding on the metal door, sending booming reverberations through the entire floor. Unfortunately, that same floor also houses the really bad guys, the rapists, murderers, muggers, the violent, hardcore crowd. The commotion wakes all of them up as well, and they are not happy. So, in response, they start their own ruckus, wondering what is going on. Dan knows this is not good. If he doesn't get a handle on the chaos right now, this is going to turn into an all-night affair. So he decides to move the man to another isolation unit on the second floor. He tells the man he's being moved to another room, actually a bigger room, with a 4-foot wide by 10-inch tall window. Maybe the aliens won't be able to find him there. And it also has a security camera inside, so a deputy at the desk just a couple of doors down will be able to watch you at all times. So if anything happens, she'll be able to come in and save you. The man thinks about it and says, okay, mainly because of the window. This way he'll be able to watch the stars through the cold night air. So Dan gets him up there, settles him in, and shuts the door. He walks down the hall through a couple of security doors and gets to the security desk with all of the CCTV monitors, sits down with the woman on duty at the desk, and together they just watch him for a while, making sure that he is calming down. They don't want him to get too agitated again and maybe try to hurt himself. For a little while, the man just stands in the center of the room, looking out the window at the stars, mumbling and self-soothing with his side-to-side swaying motion. But suddenly, he walks to the window, puts his hand on it for a few minutes, then runs back to the other side of the room and yells at the security camera, "They're coming!" Then runs back to the window, puts his hand on the glass for a moment, and again runs back to the camera, "They're coming!" The man repeats this loop over and over again for over a half hour, always screaming the message, "They're coming!" In the meantime, Dan is on the phone with the hospital psych ward trying to find out if they know of any way that they can help calm this guy down. Unfortunately, they are of exactly zero help. Great. So Dan and the other deputy just keep watching as the man becomes more and more hysterical until eventually he's in full-on panic mode. The man walks to the corner of the room where the camera is and gets so close that his face fills the entire picture and screams, "They're here! They're here!" Now, keep in mind that this building is the county lockup, so they have cameras everywhere covering every angle. Nothing out of the ordinary is happening outside. The other deputies coming in and out all night don't see anything. The cameras don't see anything. And even the dogs are acting like business as usual. But as Dan is watching the monitor, watching this man in his cell shouting at the camera, trying to figure out how to calm him down, a blue flash of light obliterates the picture on the monitor. When the camera recovers its picture, the man is gone. Dan grabs his keys and starts running toward the cell, unlocking 3 heavy security doors along the way. When he gets to the man's cell and opens that door, all he sees is the rubber slippers on the floor, facing the camera right where the man had just been standing. He searches the room. Not like there's a whole lot to search, but he looks under the bed, around the room, and even up at the ceiling and sees nothing. No means of escape and no man. Dan calls the midnight patrol sergeant on duty and says, "Hey, we have an inmate missing." The patrol sergeant immediately issues an all-points bulletin for the missing man. A few minutes later, the patrol sergeant and an on-duty detective, both very seasoned officers, meet Dan and the other deputy at the second-floor control desk, where Dan and his associate proceed to tell the 2 new guys exactly what happened. Of course, the new guys, the street guys, think the jail guys are off their rockers. So Dan shows him the tape. As the blue flash and empty room play out in front of their disbelieving, bulging eyes, a rather loud chorus of WTF? Wow, that's fantastic! Echoes through the second floor. All 4 officers go back to the cell and look all around, making sure they don't touch anything. Everything is perfect, exactly the way that it should be, except the man is gone. The patrol sergeant calls in a forensics team. He wants to know how this guy got out. The team combs the entire cell and takes pictures of absolutely everything from every conceivable angle. By the time they're done, everyone's even more confused. Not only is the man not there like he should be, but neither are his fingerprints or any other trace of him. Anyone watching the video can see, plain as day, the man walk to the window over and over and put his hand on it. But there's no longer any trace that he was ever in that cell. It's like the flash not only took the man, but every trace of him that was in that room. A few hours later, and Dan is sitting in the sheriff's office anticipating the ass-chewing he's about to get when the sheriff comes storming in. No one has ever escaped his jail before, and he wants answers and a fugitive capture. Dan hands over his 5-page report, which includes statements from every jail officer on duty last night and the video of the incident. The sheriff takes a look at it, then tells Dan to stand by. We have to wait for someone. Dan has no idea what that means, but sure enough, 2.5 hours later, 2 very tall, very skinny, platinum blonde men arrive wearing black suits, black ties, and white starched shirts. Their skin is about as white as their shirts, and so thin that Dan can see the veins underneath. Not to mention that they look like one could be a clone of the other, and they have eyes that are so bright blue, Dan's never seen anything like it in nature before, and the way they walk looks more like a glide than a step. Dan has heard the rumors of the men in black and feels very uneasy about these 2, who couldn't look more like the 4chan stories if they tried. The sheriff chats with these guys behind closed doors for about 15 minutes before he calls Dan back in. He hands Dan's report over to one of these ghost guys who starts flipping through it as the sheriff tells Dan that these guys are from the Department of Aeronautic Technical Command within the Department of Defense. Fake! He says they have paperwork from the U.S. Attorney General, the DOD, and the Senate Armed Services Committee directing them to work with Thing 1 and Thing 2 on this investigation. Okay. They start discussing the information in Dan's report. Dan is more than a little surprised that Thing 1 starts discussing the details of the report like he'd written it himself, after just casually flipping through the pages. And he knew the employment record, personal, and family history of every officer who had worked on the case so far, including Dan. Thing 1 then, not so surprisingly, drops the trump card of, "This is a matter of national security, so we'll be taking over the case from here." Didn't see that one coming from a mile away. Of course, they tell everyone that they are to speak of this to no one, including family members. If they do, they'll face military charges. Thing 1 then gives Dan a hard stare and a creepy little grin as he tells him, "And you, of all people, should know what it would be like to serve time in a military prison." So that's it. Non-disclosure agreements are signed by everyone involved. Thing 1 and Thing 2 leave, never to be seen again, and not another word is ever spoken about the case. When Dan reports for work the next night, all files regarding the case have been wiped, and the man's belongings are gone. And several of the deputies that were on duty last night have called in sick, many of whom would resign over the next few days. One person who does come back is the deputy who is monitoring the cameras on the second floor. She calls Dan and says, "Come here, you gotta see this." She shows Dan the current camera feed from the cell that the man had been in the night before. I guess everyone had been too busy watching the reruns to notice the camera's live feed. There in front of the lens is the faint, ghostly white image of the man's screaming face. Somehow that blue flash must have seared an imprint of the man's image right into the glass. Not surprisingly, that camera was replaced just a couple of days later. And that's it. The last piece of evidence that the man had ever been there is gone. Dan closes his letter to Ted by telling him that ever since that night, so many years ago, he hasn't had a good night's sleep. Instead, enduring nightmares every time he closes his eyes. Dan made it to retirement and moved to a warmer climate just like he had planned. He enjoyed himself for about a year before health issues started creeping in. After 6 months of tests and treatments with no actual cause for his sickness ever being found, all of Dan's internal organs just all shut down together. His letter to Ted was written just 3 days before Dan died, with the full knowledge that he would never again be getting up from that bed. I mean, I guess as he's in that position, knowing that there's nothing else that anyone, not the government nor any other intelligent force, can take from him, he decided it was time for the world to know what happened that cold night in that Alaskan jail. Most people will probably admit that they believe that there is other intelligent life out there somewhere in the universe. But Dan discovered it's actually here. And if it wants to find you, it will. Special thanks to our in-betweener Ted for sending us Dan's letter. I would like to thank both Ted and Dan for their service. And wherever Dan is now, I'm sorry he paid a higher price than most, and I hope he's finally resting in peace. Personally, I'm not all that surprised to hear that this happened in Alaska. Alaska is a very strange state. If you want to take the plunge and find out why, click right here. Be careful out there, and I will see you here again on the In-Between.